Let's look at Chapter 21 on CSS and Chapter 22 on Git workflow. CSS is all about styling the web. So what is it exactly? We'll talk about the meaning behind it and the concept, and then we'll look at the structure and syntax. I'm going to talk about the different types of selectors that you can define for applying your CSS to your HTML. And then talk about some of the most common properties that you might see out there and use. And then we will talk about the different places you can actually put the CSS in order for it to work together with your HTML, because there is more than one way to do it. And then I'm going to touch very briefly on a couple of advanced topics in case you are interested in learning more when you have time later down the road. CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets. So once upon a time, we had to manually edit the style of every single element in every HTML file, no matter how many pages you had, and it was very inefficient and very tedious. Somebody came up with CSS, which allows you to define a style once, assign it to one or more elements, and then let it cascade throughout your site. So then later, let's say you want to make another change down the road. All you have to do is alter that style sheet, and the site is automatically going to update everywhere. Boom. That's why they call it cascading. So let's say you have all your styles in this file, and you make a change and save it, and boom, all of the pages will now have the new style that you want. So this is where we're headed. Let's talk about the structure and syntax. There are some vocabulary words here that you need to know. A selector is what you use to apply the style to an HTML element. And there's three kinds. We are going to talk about them in detail in a minute. Element selectors, class selectors, and ID selectors. And these selectors usually use kebab case, but you might sometimes see them in camel case. And then there's the property. The property identifies what aspect of the styling you wish to define. So you can have like a single selector and define a whole bunch of different properties to be applied all at the same time. But a value has to be set for each property. And you'll notice that they are set as key value pairs, but you follow each of them with a semicolon instead of a comma. Otherwise, the syntax really does look very familiar to a JavaScript object. So again, this is called a selector. And background color there is an example of a property. And it takes this value. This is called a hex value for colors. You can look into that. And then, of course, I have a whole bunch of additional properties here and all of their values, right? So let's talk about these individual selectors, because this is only one type of selector. It's a class selector. Let's talk first about the element selector. We're going to start with things you already know, because you've learned a little bit of HTML and you know about these tags, right? So you can actually say, I just want to style everything that has this tag and use that, and that's called an element selector. So if you have multiple elements in your file with that tag, that styling will be applied to all of them unless you override it on an individual element by using like an ID or a class selector, which we're going to talk about next. But this would be the broadest way to apply styling. So if you applied it to body, like here, font family Arial and sans serif, font size 11 point, everything in that content then would be that font family and that font size. But you could use other ones to maybe assign different values on a smaller scale that would override what's in the entire body. That's the idea here. So this is an element selector. It corresponds directly to an HTML element. The next example is a class selector. So this corresponds to a custom class attribute that you place on a tag. So let's say you have an H3, you could put the attribute class on it, and then in quotes, give the name of the class. In the CSS declaration in your style sheet, you're going to need to precede that name by a period, and that indicates that it's a class selector. A class can be used on multiple elements. So you can be very selective and just put them on maybe like 3 of them, but you can put it wherever you want. and you can put it on more than one. So here I've got this example of H4 being specifically a class subtitle so that I can apply some style to this particular H4 without applying style to all of my H4s. And then here I define it, and you can see there it's got the period in front of it. So that's with the name, that's the class selector, and this is the definition. The third type is the ID selector. This corresponds to a custom ID attribute that you place on a tag. So you precede it by a hashtag in the CSS, and you can only use one of that ID per file. You can't use it multiple times. It can only be applied to one particular element. So here we have a div, and we're saying this particular div is going to hold the author bio. So we're going to give this the ID of author bio. So we might define it in the CSS file over here like this. It's got the hashtag in front of it, author bio. And over here, where we use the attribute ID, we just gave the name. Here's where we use the hashtag. And then we have, whatever properties we want to apply to just that particular div with that ID. Okay, so 3 different selectors: element, class, ID. Let's look at some of the common properties. And before I switch this slide, I want to say, don't get overwhelmed. I just made a list of some of the most common. There are lots of resources out there for you to learn about these. But let's see, I broke them down kind of into a couple of broad categories. These are ones you would typically apply to text. So what color do you want the text to be? Font size, font weight, font family, font style, line height. Text decoration is something you could use to do underlining, for example. Text transform would be something like uppercase. And then there's container properties that really have more to do with laying things out on the page, or filling a container with a background color, for example. You can align your text within it, give it a specific height and width and margin and padding to make sure you've got space around it or space just inside it, so that if you have a div and it has some text in it, maybe you don't want the text right up against the edges, you can put a little padding in. So that's what all these are for. There's all different types of things you can do, and I'm going to demonstrate a variety of these today, and then over the course of the next few classes, as I'm teaching additional things that have to do where we're, basing a web page on HTML and CSS, I will continue to use other things, and you'll see more examples. So before I do we haven't gotten to any code yet, and that's okay. I'm going to show you some code in a minute, but I need to talk about where you would put this, right? We've talked about how to write these definitions and what the selectors are, and then what some of these properties might be, but where do you put it? How do you make it actually work with your HTML? There are 3 places to do it. We call this external versus internal versus inline. So external is placed in another file. You'll often see it called styles.css or maybe style.css. You import it into the HTML file in the head with a link that has a source, an href. So if you look over here, you can see this link with this little href attribute, and that gives the location of the file. And then you also need to say type and rel and give it the values text/CSS and style sheet. Altogether, those 3 attributes will make it possible for your HTML file to know about and apply the styles from that CSS file. Okay. The next place would be internal. So it uses regular syntax, but you actually can just place it between style elements in the HTML file. So this has opening and closing tags, and you would just put it in between. You can actually put the style, the grouping of the CSS within the style element in either the head or at the very end of the body. It'll work either way. And any internal CSS you have is going to override any properties from an external file. So keep that in mind. If you have something that might cause a conflict, the stuff that's in your, internally between those style tags is actually going to take precedence. The third one is inline. So you would actually put this inside an HTML tag, and you saw me do this in the last class when I was demonstrating how to use span. So you use the style attribute on the HTML element itself, and then you give all of the properties, those key value pairs, in quotes, and just separate them by their semicolons, but you don't use those curly braces that you would use in a formal definition. So inline, as I'm sure you can imagine, overrides anything in the external or internal CSS. So this is the one that takes the highest precedence. That being said, it's generally discouraged to do it this way, because this you would have to come and edit, manually, and you can't have any sort of cascading effect if it's defined inline like this. So use this sparingly. There's only going to be so many situations where you'd really want to do it this way. You have so many other options. You could always apply an ID and overwrite it from your style sheet before you would want to do something like this. But you're going to see it this way. And when we get to some other stuff in the future, you're going to see where it comes into play that, for instance, when you're working with JavaScript, like you can only read what the properties are when they're actually inline. So the browser deals with it this way. And so you're going to see it this way in the browser dev tools too. Okay. So let me go ahead and demonstrate this external versus internal versus inline. I've got a file here in my slide examples directory in the chapter 21 directory that just has some examples of these locations. And I've got my style sheet over here that just has an ID selector called external with, a border that is dotted in dark red and some padding and a width and margin. And then internally, I've got some style, a style element here, and just a class, an internal class that has some styling. And then right here, I've got examples of where I've put inline styling on a couple of different elements. So we're going to take a look at what this looks like. I'm going to use Live Server. So I'm going to right click and open with Live Server. And we can see our examples here. I'm going to open up DevTools so we can play around with this a little bit. Okay. So we can immediately see that the external CSS example has this div around it with the ID of external. So everything inside this div, including the div itself, is governed by the styling according to this. And I don't have any sort of internal or inline styling here to override it. So we're always going to see whatever's an external right here for the time being. Inline is where I have, this color that's this blue color, and it's got a little padding there and a background color. And then I've applied that same blue to the font of my H2 here as well. And so you can see that because this is applied here, it's not going to get applied anywhere else. It's specifically for these. Down here, I've got this internal box, and you can see that I've given it the class internal, and that definition is actually down here, right here in the file. And so that class dot internal is defined with, ghost white is the text, the background color is gray, and you can see it's got its own, padding and border radius, so it's got the little curved, edges of the border, things like that. So some different stuff happening here. And you can kind of see that things might get interesting if we started playing around with precedence, right? So let's say that I wanted to come over and enable this H2 here to turn the H2's blue. Well, immediately you see that it's applying that to the external and the internal because it overrides external, and certainly it's going to apply to internal. But it does not change the color of the inline one, because inline always takes precedence, even over internal, because we already had something applied specifically to an H2 here that's a different color. So that should give you a little bit of a picture of how you can do it different ways. And you can, see this illustrated, how this precedence works. Okay. I'm going to close that. And I'm going to very briefly mention that there are some advanced topics that are probably important for you to learn if you think you might want to go into front-end work like this. And responsive design is a big one because everyone goes on the web on different devices these days, right? Different sizes. So you have to allow for that. Your page has to be flexible and have a different layout depending on the size of the device. There are a couple of systems built into CSS. One's called Flexbox, another's called Grid. You can look into those that just have a system of specific properties that you can use, and you can create your own classes to apply them or whatever you would like. And they will help with this idea of making your page flexible. Media queries are something that will let you set different values for your same properties and classes and things, depending on things that the browser's keeping track of, like the screen width. So you could say from this screen width to that screen width, I would like for, this property to be this value. Otherwise, I want it to be this value. Animation is something that is, pretty much all over the place these days. And there's different ways to do it. You can actually set keyframes that will allow you to define some properties that you want to change over time and give them the different values that it should change to. And you can set the duration and the mode with animation property. But you also can define some visual changes just with transition and transform. You don't even need animation for a number of things. On my personal website, I've got a lot of responsive stuff where you can, hover over something and it changes or things like that. And it's pretty much done with, almost all of it is done with transition and transform. So just some things to keep in mind. It might be some things you want to look into in the future. All right, I have another big example for CSS that we're going to do, but I'm going to do it in the context of the things I want to talk about today with Git workflow. So I would like to go straight to my Git slides so we can talk a little bit about branching and things like that. And then I will do the rest of the live coding that I plan to do to illustrate using CSS. So when you are using a remote repository, you have this whole workflow going, right? And when you are doing it with other people and collaborating, then that workflow becomes really important to understand. So I'm going to talk about all of that. So I'll talk about default versus feature branches and how you might create branches and switch branches. I'm going to talk about pushing your commits to GitHub when you have a new branch that's never been pushed before and doesn't currently exist on GitHub like your main branch would. I'll talk about merging branches, and I'm going to show you how to do it both locally with two branches and just merge them on your local machine. And then I'll also talk about how you would do it on GitHub. I'll talk about how to collaborate with someone else and just give you some general helpful tips. So default versus feature branches. The way that this works in the real world is that you use lots and lots of different branches in the development process. The default branch, which these days is called main, but you may still see some code where it's called master, it would never have code pushed directly to it like you've been doing for most of your assignments. In the professional setting, you always want to make sure that you develop on feature branches and make sure the code is working and not broken at all, and it is absolutely what you want to be in your main project before you merge it into main. So you create these feature branches, they're based on the main branch. You branch off of main, and then you work on your stuff, and then eventually you work on merging everything back with the goal of getting it to main. So, but that only happens after being reviewed and approved. You work with a team. And so you're going to have senior developers and managers who are going to look over your code and give you feedback, and you might make a few more changes. And then when everyone's happy with it, that's when it gets approved. And then it'll be merged in. And that's, absolutely critical for making sure that the application that runs from the default branch is never going to be broken. So how do you create a feature branch? You need to make sure you're in main. You always want to go off of the newest version of whatever the not broken code is. And so generally speaking, you're going to be going off of main so that you can just add to the existing project. And you can check to see what the branches are with git branch. That's a command you can use. And if someone else is collaborating with you and they've merged code into that branch, the default branch, because they've already made updates from someone else's work, you're going to need to make sure you do a git pull to make sure you have the most current version of main locally. And I'll talk about that again in a little bit, but that's going to be very important. When you're working back and forth with somebody, and whether it's main or not, either way, you have to make sure that you have the most recent version if other people are making changes to something. But certainly if you're going to be branching off of main, you want the most current version of main. So it's always a good idea to do a git pull if you think that someone else may have made changes to it. Then you use this command to create a new branch, git checkout -b, and then you give it a branch name, new branch name, something like that. And hyphenating it is what most people do, using that kebab case, lowercase hyphenated. So to break this down, the -b part is what creates the new branch. Checkout just moves you to the new branch. So later, when you just want to move back and forth between branches, you just use git checkout. But if you want to create a new branch, you have to use that -b. That's a very important distinction. A lot of students forget about that in the beginning. So I'll say it one more time. The -b creates a new branch. The checkout part moves you. So when you use git checkout -b, it's going to both create it and move you there at the same time. Now, if you just want to move around, just use git checkout. Okay, I'm going to keep going through this so we can talk about it all, and then we're going to go do it. So just hang with me for a minute. If you want to send your version of the code, you already know how to do, basic commits and pushes, right? So you go into whatever repo directory you need to be in, make sure you've committed whatever code needs to be pushed up, and you already know how to do the whole staging and committing process. And then main is always, especially if you started on GitHub and brought your code down, but generally speaking, main is already going to be linked because it was the original branch, right? But so you can just git push, that's what you're accustomed to doing, is just doing git push. When you create a feature branch, the very first time that you do it, you have to do it a little bit differently. So you're going to need to do git push -u and then origin and then branch name. And that's going to actually make it possible for GitHub to have knowledge now of your new branch, and it has that connection now, it's linked. And so after that, once you do that, the very first time for that new branch, once it's already on GitHub, you just can do git push after that, just regular old git push. So just keep that in mind. And the thing is, if you try to do git push with a new branch that GitHub doesn't know about, it's going to warn you, and it's going to give you a version of this and tell you, oh, hey, you need to put this command in. It's going to be a little longer. The -u is short for --set upstream. So it may tell you to do it that way, but that's what it means. And this just says push it, it's new. So set a new upstream link, set it to link it to origin, and this should be the branch name. Okay. So let's go ahead now, and I'm going to do some of this, and we will code for a bit. And then I'm going to talk about how to merge branches, and we'll come back to the slides for a little bit. But I just want to get some of this CSS going. So last time, you remember we had our garden blog, right? And when we left, it looked very 1997. So we are going to do something about that. So we've got an index page that, has all the same content that you had seen before. And now we've got a styles.css sheet that has a bunch of to-dos, whole lot of to-dos. I even have keyframes. Look at that. I'm gonna show you how to link up keyframes later, just bonus material for you. So if we look over in our index.html file, we see that we need to link this file, or else it doesn't matter how many CSS definitions we put in there, it's not gonna know about it, right? So let's go ahead and do that at the very top. I will set a link inside the head, right below my title here. And I'm going to say href equals /styles.css. There we go. And this is in the same file, so I could even leave this off and just say styles.css, but I'm going to do that anyway, just to show that it's the relative path there. And then I'll say type equals text/CSS and rel equals style sheet. Okay, self-closing tag for that, and we're done. Okay, so that to-do is knocked off. All right. Now I have made a change already that I have not committed. Here's what I'm going to need to do. I have previous changes from the example I did earlier where I came in and right down here, I had uncommented this H2. And let's say I want to keep that change, but I don't really want to do it in my new feature branch. I'd rather keep it in this branch. So I'm going to do a selective stage. First, let me do a get status to see everything that has changes. And now I have changes in two different files. I really would like to be selective about this. So I'm going to say get add, and instead of using dot, I'm going to go grab the slide examples one and copy that and put just that one file and say add that one. And now if I do a get status, I see that it's staged and the other one is not. And that's exactly what I want because I only want this one to be committed. So I can say, get commit -m, and I'll say uncommented H2 for example of precedence or something. Okay, so that's good. So now the only change left is the one that I actually want in my new branch. So I'm just going to let it sit there. And I'm going to create a new branch, and we'll take our change with us. So I'm going to say get checkout -b merge example. Let's just call it merge example. That'll be my branch. Okay. And now that I've done that, notice if I do a get branch command, you can see I have a lot of branches. Let me page through these. There we go. So you can see that I have merge example is here and I am on that branch. It's in green and it's got a little asterisk by it. And you can also see I've got main and solution, and there's the branch I was on a minute ago, demos March 2024. So I can hit Q to get out of this and go back to my prompt. Okay, so now that I've created my new branch, I still want to make that commit. So again, if I do a get status, we can see that still isn't staged, right? So I'll do a get add all because that's the only change I've made. And we can verify. And there it is. It's staged and ready to go. So I'm going to make my very first commit in my new feature branch. Say get commit -m linked CSS file to HTML file. Okay. And we're good. Okay, so that's going to be our process. So I'm going to go to the next to-do now. Let's see. I set this up ahead of time so that it would already be here, but I am using the search tool in VS Code. I'm searching for my to-dos, but because I have all of the chapters in here, I have a lot of to-dos in this branch. I isolated it here to I hit the little 3 dots and isolated it to the chapter 21 folder so I could see just the ones relevant to what we're doing now. So you can see we've got a few to-dos in the HTML file, but there's actually most of them are in the CSS file. And it looks like a lot, but some of this is going to go really fast. So I'm going to start with the to-dos that are in the CSS file. That's kind of going to be our sequence. And then we're going to find that some of the to-dos in the HTML file are related to this. So the first one says to add some CSS for the body so that we can start to make this change. And before I forget, we should be looking at this in the browser, right? So let me open this with Live Server. And I will add this over here. It opened up on a different screen, but here we have it. Okay. And we can see here that it looks just like it did when we left off after our last class on HTML. So we just have HTML in here, but not any CSS yet, really. So let's go ahead and start making our changes. So I can say, I want to apply something to the entire body and change the font family. So I'm going to start with an element selector and just say, I want to apply this to the entire body. I'll change the color of the text to a very obscure color green. Okay. And then I'm going to change let's go ahead and just do these in order. Font family and change it to Arial and Helvetica and sans serif. So VS Code will suggest some of these common ones that are built into browsers, so you don't have to have anything special installed for them. And basically the way this works is these are backups for these, in case for some reason it wasn't available on somebody's system. We'll set a width. And already you're seeing the changes on the page, right? And this 100 VW is going to do something interesting because that's 100% of the view width. But it's going to be strange when we start to set our padding and stuff. And I'm going to show you how to fix that because this comes up all the time for people. So if we set it, we wanted some padding to get the contents away from the edges on the left and the right, I could set it 0 for the top and bottom and 10 view width for the left and right. But notice how everything's off, right? It's moved it over, but it's still making the entire width of the page 100%, not like, and then adding on the padding rather than subtracting out of it. There's a way to get around that. You can add this property called box sizing and give it the value border box. And as soon as you do that, now it fixes it. Otherwise, what you would have to do is say, okay, 10 plus 10 is 20. And so that means you have to change this to 80, but you really mean 100%. So, 100% with padding subtracted is what you intend. So this box sizing thing will make it where you can keep those numbers where they make sense. All right, and then I'm just going to set the margin to 0 so that it forces everything to calculate exactly from the edges of the window and not with any sort of default margin that it might be built in with. Okay. So this is good. We already have some white space over here on the left and the right. So things are starting to look a little better. And we have a cleaner font that's a little easier to read in some ways. And we've got a green text, which, is an interesting choice on my part. But we're going to go with it. Okay, so that took care of these to-dos. We have one more here. That blossom image that we currently have on the page, we'd like to take it out of here and use it as our background instead. So we can do that. And come over here and just remove this entirely. We're just going to take it out. And so now we have no image here, but if we come over into our body definition, we can actually add a property here, background, and use this URL to pass in the path and then say fixed because we want it to stay put even when we scroll. Okay, so I can scroll and you'll notice that the background just stays where it is no matter how I'm scrolling. Of course, now we have a problem because our text can't be viewed on top of this, so we really need to apply some additional styling to just this section and not the entire body so that the text will have a background of its own. So now we need to work on that. We're going to work on setting backgrounds for the header and the footer, and then we'll also set the background of main, and we're going to make that a different color. So for the header and footer, we'll set that to dark green, and then we're going to override the color of the text that's set for the entire body by setting it to white for just the header and the footer. Let's do that. So I'll say header and footer. We can apply styling with one definition to more than one element by just putting a comma between them like this. And we'll say the text color should be white, and the background should be RGB, and I'm going to give it 32/70/32. So you can use hex codes, and this like I did above, and you can also use RGB, red, green, blue. Notice that VS Code has this handy little tool where you could come in here and play around with the colors and test different things. That's a really nice feature. And then we'll set some padding because you'll notice before I do that, we have this coloring all set, but everything's right up against the edges. So this is why padding is so helpful. It can help push everything away from the edges inside the box a little bit. So we'll set padding to 10 pixels for the top and bottom and 30 pixels for the left and right. And that looks much better. And you might wonder why I went with a smaller number for the top and the bottom, even though it looks about the same. And that's because the headings, what do we have? H2 and H3 or H2 and H4, something like that. These headings have styling implications. They actually have a greater line height, and that line height pushes them away from the top and the bottom already. So then you have to adjust here to account for that and say, I don't need quite as much padding on the top and bottom as I need on the left and right, because there's already this line height built in on those. Okay, but that's better now. It's got, it's pushed away from the edges, right? These are the kind of considerations you want to think about. Let's do the background of main. So we can set the background color of main to white, just plain old white. So we can do that one by name. There are a number of things that you can just use names for, and that you can find a list of those online. And then I'll give it a padding all the way around of 30 pixels, and look how much better that looks. Wow. Okay, so my footer and my header both have the green background with the white text, and my main section has the white background with the green text. So it's starting to come together. It's starting to look a little better, right? Okay, let's take these to-dos off. All right, now I've just done quite a bit of work. It's I'll take this one off too. It's a pretty good time for me to stop and make a commit. So I'm going to, that was a good status. Okay, if I use my shortcuts, my aliases, I apologize. I'm so used to it. I'm going to add both of these because I've made styles to both the CSS and the HTML, but they go together. They, only work together, right? So I need to commit them together. So I'll add both of those and verify that they're staged, and they are. And so I'll do my commit. And this time my description will be that I updated background and font styling for body, header, footer, and main. Okay. They kind of needed to be done in conjunction with one another, so it makes sense to put them on one commit. Okay. Now let's start adjusting something for a different element. Let's work on an H1. We have in our document, we have a number of different headings. We have H1, H2, H3, and H4. So we're going to selectively start changing these a little bit. I'm going to make the H1 have a font family, and this is going to be something generic that's just built into the browser, and just make it cursive. And you can see what this looks like on my machine. This is what it chooses for the font for that on my system. And then I'll use REM, which means 4 times the regular text size of this page. And then for the margin, I'm going to add 10 pixels to the top and say 0 on the left and the right. And that's overriding what's built into an H1 automatically. So you can customize it. You don't have to stick with the margins or line heights that are built into the H1. You can make them whatever you want. So that's what I want to do there. And then for the H2, I would like to change the font weight and the font size. So I'll start off with font weight, and you can use values here like lighter or bolder, things like that. I'm going to go with lighter. You can also use number values. Fonts are measured in things like 400 and 700 and 200. All of that will work. All right, change our font size, and I'm going to use text transform and make it uppercase so that it's in all caps. And now we see right here, it's in all caps. And I'm going to do one more interesting thing, which is to do letter spacing and actually space it out a little bit. This is kerning, so I'm increasing the space between all the letters. And then we'll also adjust the margin on this one just a little bit. Okay, so that's looking pretty good. It's looking a little bit nicer, not having it just be the default, settings for everything. Okay. So let's keep going with our headings and then we'll make another commit. All right, so with H3, I would like to actually give it like a background color and a different color. So I'm going to go background color, RGB 54, 122, and 33. And we'll make the text color white. So just remember, background color means the color behind something in a box sense. And you could apply it to text. We just did, right? We applied it to the whole H3. And the color means the text itself. Font size will increase to 1.3 REM. And then the padding, I'm going to set to 8 pixels. And as soon as I add the padding, notice how much nicer that looks because the text isn't right up against the edges of the box. It now accommodates it with a little bit of cushion in there. Looks much better. Okay, so that's the H3. I'd also like to do something with the H4 that's a little different. For the sake of time, I'm going to paste this one in. And you can see I've set the color white. It looks very similar to what I did for H3, but I've used a linear gradient that goes from left to right and actually goes from this color green to white. And so you can see how that looks. So that gives you an idea of an interesting thing you could do there. In this case, I went with the font weight bolder and, transformed it to uppercase. So now my subheadings look, a little bit different. It's easier to see this is like a section and this is like, within that section, right? Okay. I also would like to alter the margins on H3 and H4, but I want to do them exactly the same way. So I'm just going to apply it to both of them separately right here. So this is totally allowed. You don't have to have just one definition for an element. If you have something you want to apply to multiple ones, you can just, create a separate definition for it, just like this. Let me get these to-dos out of here. Clean this up a little bit. All right, so I'm going to say margin. And what I'm going to do here is say 30 pixels for the top, 0 pixels for the left and right, and 0 pixels for the bottom. So when you only have 3 of them, it goes top, left, right, and bottom. Okay. So that adjusted them just a little bit to make sure that there's a little bit of extra text above them, separating them out from the bottom of whatever the last thing is in the previous section, and it just looks a little nicer now. So those kinds of small adjustments can make a really big difference in somebody's ability to read something. And they visually scan your page and they can pick out what they're looking for if things are spaced really well. It actually makes a difference. Things they teach you in like graphic design and marketing. Okay, so now I would like to change the bullet points to squares. So these bullet points right now are the default round bullet, but we can change them very easily. We can just say, I want my unordered lists, all of them, which I only have one, but I want them to have a list style type of square. And now I don't know if you can see it on the screen because I know it's a little bit small, but they are square now. And that's all I had to do. Let's set the font color for the table. I would like for this, we're going to do quite a few things to this table. I would like to set it to a dark charcoal gray. So I'm going to set it to, let's see, table, and we'll say color for everything inside the table should be great. And I think you're probably picking up now that, when you apply style to something as a parent element, it automatically applies it to everything inside of it unless you override it otherwise. So we have a whole table that now has, this very, very dark gray instead of green. And I didn't have to apply it to the TDs and the THs and TRs because I just applied it to the whole table. Okay, we also would like to center align and handle the width and padding of our TH and TDs. You may remember that previously we had put some styling here. Let me find it. Yeah, we had manually put this width attribute on the THs, which forced it for the whole table, but we had to do it in every single one. And that's not ideal, right? So now we're going to take that away and we're actually going to do this with CSS instead, which is desirable. We want to make it where we can just go change it in one place and apply it to all of them all at once. And the other thing we're going to do is get rid of this text align center here and get rid of the inline styling and do this part with CSS as well. So, which is what I think that's the one I just did, right? Nope, I haven't done that yet. Yep. Okay, we're going to do that now. Okay. I was applying it from the table. Now I'm going to apply it using the TH and TD while we're doing the other thing. That's the difference. Okay. Just making sure I'm not missing anything here. Let's do this. So I'm going to start with TH and TD and say text align center, which we previously had applied to the table. But it's okay to just apply it here. And we'll say width is 80 pixels. And now we see everything's got that nice spacing back that we had before. And I'm going to add a padding of 8 pixels to top and bottom and 0 left and right, which gives us a little bit more spacing, and that's kind of nice to separate it out just a little bit. And then we can also set a consistent height for the TDs. So we can do that. I'll just do that separately here. And because I don't want to apply it to the THs, just to the thing. So I'm going to say, let's apply that so that the TDs have the same height and width. And I feel like there's something not quite right here, but I'm not sure what it is. So I'm going to keep going with this and we'll see what shakes out. Okay. All right, now we can do some interesting things with our rows. You may have seen a lot of tables are styled where the rows are alternating colors because it helps, again, that's another one of those things that they've proven that it helps you visually be able to find what you're looking for more easily if the rows are alternated. So we're going to do that. There's this thing you can do. So I'm going to apply it to the header row, and I'm also going to apply it to the even ones. So I'm going to say tr colon nth child, and then I'm going to specify even. So every nth, every even row is going to have this styling, and I'll say background color is hashtag BBB. And that's just short for saying BBB. When they're all the same like that, you can shorten it to 3 instead of 6. And then I can do the same thing for the odds with a different color and say tr nth child odd, and say background color is hashtag EEE. And now we see a lighter gray, and it looks like this. Okay. Yeah, that actually, it looks pretty decent. I was surprised. I think, honestly, I mean, if I set the height at like 60 pixels, yeah, I think I like that a little better. Okay. But see, this is the thing. You play around with it, you make your decisions. Okay. So I think I said earlier that I was going to make a commit after I did all of the headings, and I did not. So that's okay. We'll go ahead and do it now. This is going to happen. You're going to sometimes forget to do it as soon as you meant to. So I'll say get status, and we change this. I can say get add all and get status again, verify that they're staged. And then I will commit them and say added styling for headings or heading elements, let's say, and table. Okay. Good. Let's do a little more. Okay. There are some things that we had done in here where we had used some built-in tags, like for example, EM for emphasis, right at the top, and it made it italics by default because that's how the browser just is going to interpret that as by italics. But it doesn't mean you have to keep that. You can have your EMs styled however you'd like. So let's do that. Let's say that we actually want the style to be normal and instead we want it to underline it. We can do that. We can just say, let's take the font style and make it normal instead of italicizing it like it does by default, and change the text decoration to underline. Now we see that it shows it to us here with the underline. Okay. Now we will change the styling of our anchors, our links. So we have link right down here. I got my bulb from Brex, and the standard since the 90s has been for that to be purple. It's blue until you click on it, and then it's purple after you've clicked on it. Now I'm not going to change the color right now. I'm just going to change the font weight and the text decoration so that we can make this one not underlined. Unlike the thing we just did, where we made it underlined on purpose. So I'll say bold, and then text decoration is none. Okay, so that's how you turn off default text decoration, like underline is to say none. And then we see now that it's bolded and it's not underlined. Okay. Now, if we look at our page, we can see that there are some places where it might be nice to have a little bit of extra bottom margin. And the first one I can see right now is immediately is between plant requirements and the table, there's not the same level of built-in margin that you have with something like a list or a paragraph, which is what's providing that cushion up there. So we are going to go ahead and just make sure we can selectively add it where we need it. So I'll create a class. And so now we're not dealing with elements anymore, right? Now we're going to do class selector. I'm going to say extra space below, make it descriptive, and say margin bottom, 15 pixels. And then we'll come over to our file and find where we need to add that. Down here in the plant requirements is where we saw it, right? Yeah. So I would like to come right here onto this H3 and just change this to class equals extra space below. Okay. So again, we use the class attribute, we give it the name here, and then it knows to use the definition that starts with a period and has that name, because that's how we designate a class selector. Okay. And then we will create a class to bump up font size. So you also remember we had this, large so that we did here, and we did that with a span with inline styling. I'm still going to use the span because I want to selectively apply styling to the so, but I'm going to use a class instead. Why don't we call this one bigger text? Okay, so I need to create a definition for this. So I'll say dot bigger text. And we will just set it with font size of 1 point, let's see. Remember how I did this last time. 1.2 REM. Okay. And now we see it looks pretty much like it did before, but we're handling it with a class instead, and that is the preferred way to do it. Okay, now we're going to set an ID selector. So we want to have a special block that has a little bit of a fancy look. So if we look at the to-dos here, we want to change this paragraph to a div. And notice that VS Code does not automatically update the closing tag, so make sure you do it in both places. Let me fix that and go back. Okay, and I can apply my ID and say ID equals, and we'll call it special. So this might have the ID of special, but nothing is going to change until we write the definition. So we'll come back over to CSS and create this with hashtag special. That's how you indicate an ID selector. And I've got a number of things that I would like to do here. I'm going to paste this in for the sake of time here, but then I'm going to cover the very last one. That's the bonus part. Okay, so right now you can see font weight is bold, the width is 50%, so it's now moved it, towards the center here. And the minimum width is 200 pixels, which just means that as I change the thing, it's no longer 50% down here because I've reached 200 and it forces it to stay that big. So that's just a little trick for you if you want to control things like that. And I've got an outline on it, a double outline of 8 pixels in a certain color. I also have these keyframes with this cool color change thing that I could do that will change both the color and the outline color. So let's apply that. I can say animation and designate color change, which is the name of the keyframes down here, and say 2 seconds and infinite. So it'll just keep doing it over and over again. And now we see both the text and the outline are changing colors rapidly. They're just going through this cycle of changing all of these crazy colors, which is, pretty loud, but effective. So there we go. We have a page that has been styled, and I need to make one last commit here. So I'll say get status and get add all, verify it, get commit -m, and I'm going to say added miscellaneous styles to replace inline styling, and added animation to box. So I'm just going to say box. Okay. And so now I have changes. I would like to if I wanted to push this branch, this is where if I try to push it, git push, it warns me and says it has no upstream branch, and I could use git push and set upstream to actually make sure that it gets pushed. However, I don't actually want to do this. This is how you would do it if you did. I actually want to merge this back into my demo March 2024 branch instead, locally here. So let's talk about how to do that. If you want to combine code from two different branches, just make sure you've committed everything in the second branch that you want to merge in, and then go to the first branch where you want it to be and use the command git merge and then the name of branch 2, and that will bring the code into branch 1. And if branch 1 has a remote counterpart, then you can use git push to update that repository. And then I'm going to talk about how you would do your merges on GitHub. We'll come back to that. So I have definitely committed and everything. Like if I do a git status right now, it says it's clean, there's nothing left to commit. So I'm going to change branches, git checkout, no -b because that's just for creating branches. I'm just doing git checkout. And the name of my other branch is demos/March 2024. And now that I'm here, I can say git merge, and all I have to do is give the name of my other branch, merge example. And it says it's fast forward, which means that it just is going and pushing through and doing everything. And there aren't any conflicts because we took existing code and just made some changes to it. So it was able to do it. You can see that in this file, there were 31 changes, some additions and some deletions. And in the other file, it was 129 lines of additions and deletions. And it looks like I forgot to take some of my to-dos out, but that's okay. We have, I've demonstrated what I wanted to demonstrate. Now, I'm not going to push anything to GitHub. These branches pretty much just stay on my local machine. But here's what you would do if you did push something so that someone else could then, possibly merge it into something on GitHub. You would want to make sure that whatever your feature branch, when you're done, that you push those commits to GitHub. And then on GitHub, you would create a pull request and get it approved. And so that would look something like this. Now, let's say I was going to do a pull request for my solution branch because it's offering that to me. Or you could go to any of your branches and just say, go to that branch and then say, I want to open a pull request. But there's lots of different ways to do it. But let's say I want to do it. The idea here is that you would be creating an opportunity for this to be reviewed by people and to be considered for merging. The reason it's called a pull request is because you're basically asking other people to pull your code and take it for a spin and try it out. And if you have like a QA team, quality analysts and stuff like that, they're going to do it. You've got different people involved. But this would be how you would do it. You would kind of just submit this to create the request, and then later they could come and look at it. And then once it was ready to merge, they'd merge it from there once it's approved. So that's kind of how you would do this here. Don't worry about it too much for now. Mostly what you're going to practice today is just collaborating on a branch, but you don't really need to worry about merging too much for now. You'll do more of that when you do your capstone project, your group project at the end of the course. Okay. Yeah, if you have conflicts, they do have to be addressed, but then the merge can be completed. You can delete the feature branch on GitHub after you're done once it's been merged in for sure, because you still have a copy of it on your local machine and it'll kind of keep things cleaned up on the code base on GitHub. So that's something to consider as well. And then back on your local machine at that point, you'd want to check out to return back to main if you actually did merge into main. And then you would need to do a git pull to make sure that that new updated version on GitHub has been pulled back to your local machine. And now you have the most recent version. So yeah, depending on whether you do this locally or remotely, you have to kind of observe all of these different steps. You're going to get lots of practice of this with the guidance of senior developers in your first job, so don't worry about it too much. Okay, so collaborating. When you have multiple developers, every person makes independent changes, and so it's important that everyone always be working with the most recent version so that when they're adding changes, they're adding it to the best, current code. And so you're doing this process of get pull and get push back and forth quite a lot. And that means that communication is absolutely key. It's important. You also want to make sure not to try not to work on the same lines of code at the same time, because that will introduce conflicts in the code where Git just doesn't know which one it's supposed to choose. So it's typically a good idea to wait until the other person has made their update and pushed their code, and then you can pull that code on your branch and then start there to make your changes. That will prevent conflicts. So that process of back and forth, you need to manage that very well. And that's why communication is so important. So when you do your studio today, you're going to get an opportunity to practice this. I have one little tip for you here about undoing your last commit. Let's say you committed something and you really did not mean to. Oops, I clicked on something I didn't mean to. Here we go. What would you do about that? If you want to abandon the commit but keep the changes you made, use git reset and then head with this little tilde 1, and that will take you back one, but basically unstage all your changes and make sure that they're still there available for you to recommit or not. So yeah, everything just gets returned to an unstaged state. And that commit will still exist, but you've moved your head, which is kind of like the position of where you are working from, to that previous commit, and then you can just move forward from there. If you do not care about the changes you'd made and you just want to get rid of it all and just go back, you can use the same command essentially, but you use this flag --hard, and that will get rid of all of those changes. And it also destroys the commit. Destroys it, undoes all the changes as if it never happened, and you'll be back at the version of the code that was at the conclusion of the previous commit, and there will be no unstaged changes. They're just gone. So depending on how you want to do it, there are lots of ways to do it. And there really are other ways to kind of do this, especially if you want to, you can do it going back more than one commit. You can, have nuances and kind of how you choose the staging and things like that. You can Google it and find out if this ever happens to you. Another resource is this Git cheat sheet for a lot of the things that we've talked about today. This will be helpful on the Atlassian site. Okay, so I have some practice for working with CSS and HTML on my website. This very first one, Hello World, I mentioned last time just as HTML. But the other two, the tables and my favorite hobby, are exercises you can do to practice with CSS as well. So I recommend that if this is very new to you and you really want to get in a little bit of extra practice and have some things explained to you a little bit, these would be good exercises to do. And then, of course, my graded assignment prep tutorials for number 4 are as easy as apple pie, which is very close to the requirements of your assignment. And Small Business Savvy will take you kind of a step beyond that with some slightly more advanced things that are not required for your graded assignment. But if you already know a lot about this, you might be ready to learn things like Flexbox and some more advanced ways to style your page. So you can check those out. Studio for today is communication log. So you're going to pair up with a classmate and collaborate, just like we do often every day in the real world. And one of you will need to get it set up and add the other person as a collaborator. And then the collaborator does not fork. You just clone, because you actually do get to push changes to that repo. It's not like you have to make your own copy. You want to be working on the same exact repository. So no forking, just cloning. And then you both should have local copies, and from there you can alternate making commits, pushing and pulling and updating the branch. And it's going to be a really good practice for when you're working together for your capstone project later in the course. All right, that's all I've got for you. I will see you next time.